Welcome again. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at arrow functions in JavaScript. Arrow functions are one of the most used function syntax in modern JavaScript. But for beginners, it can be quite difficult to understand. I will break it down so you'll realize it's not as complicated as it seems and be able to use it anytime, anywhere. Let's go. Arrow functions are just like basic functions. They both take parameters, perform operations, and can return the result of some operations. However, arrow functions do provide greater flexibility in certain scenarios that we will test out soon. Before we get to arrow functions, let's quickly look at anonymous functions. They are pretty much the first step in the basic JavaScript functions evolution into arrow functions. You can see the function is a bit simplified because it doesn't have a function name. Instead, the function is assigned to a const variable which holds the function. Since the variable holds the function, it can now be called like a function and arguments can be passed to it. Now, looking at arrow functions, you can see that all the extra information in the function declaration has been narrowed down to give us a quick and easy way of creating functions. Arrow functions have been simplified a bit further than the anonymous functions we just looked at. We can see the keyword function and the function name are no longer declared, leaving the parentheses holding the parameters. Then you put up the fat arrow. This makes JavaScript know that you are trying to create an arrow function, followed by the function body, which is usually surrounded by parentheses or curly brackets. In cases where we have a single line expression like this, you don't need to add a return statement because it will be returned by default. You can see how much easier it is to write arrow functions. Now, let's look at some examples. Okay, so now we are going to look at some examples of simple arrow functions, and then later on we will look at a more typical practical example. So let's go ahead and create a const variable, call it add, and we're going to use the arrow function. So we use the parentheses for our parameters. So we use a, b, and then we use the fat arrow, which tells JavaScript that we are trying to create an arrow function. And then for the part where the expression will be, we just put in our expression a plus b, simple as that. And then let's try to log this out. Since our add has been assigned to a function, so we can call it as a function, as you already know. So you put in the values, the arguments, and then so simple as that, we have our answer. So let's look at another example. This time we're going to take this function is going to be a function whereby any number that is passed in will get multiplied by 3. So in this case, since we're using only one parameter, we don't need to wrap it around brackets. That is basically arrow function allows us to simplify it like that. Don't forget the arrow function. And then you just simply call the parameter and multiply and add times 3. And let's try to log this out. Remember, add 3 is now a function, so we call it as a function. Simple as that. And then you just pass in any value that we want to multiply by 3. And in this case, let's look at 100. Okay, so if it works nicely, this should print 300, and it does. So these are two basic examples. So next, we are going to look at a more complicated example using arrow functions. So for this example, I've already created a simple HTML button. simple HTML button like this. I've called it button, give it an ID, and you can see it rendered in the HTML view. Okay, so now what we are going to do, we're just going to add a listener to this button, and then we're going to use an arrow function. So let's go ahead and just create a const variable and use the document object to get the button using query selector. We just put in our ID of the button, and then we add event listener, call add event listener, then the event type, which is a click event, and then the callback. So in this callback, this is where we're going to be using arrow functions, and these are typically the areas where arrow functions are used. Now what we have here is a callback function, which basically gets information from the event source. So for this we can just use an arrow function, and then within curly brackets, since we're writing a statement, we use curly brackets, and then we just log out that is clicked. So let's run this, and then let's see what happens. Let's click on it again. Let's look at the output. Okay, we have to click on the button. So let's click on the button, and we can see click on it again. So we can see the output is there. So these are typical examples where arrow functions are used within callbacks as callback functions, or in higher order functions, which we will look at later. All right. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.